In today's heartfelt story, we follow the journey of Alexander Gray, a man who seemingly has it all: a thriving career as a successful CEO, a beautiful wife named Elizabeth, and a promising future filled with love and joy. But as the news of their first child on the way fills Alexander with excitement, little does he know that a single moment of betrayal will unravel everything he holds dear. This is a story about love, trust, and the consequences of choices that can change a life forever. Join us as we dive into Alexander's world, where every decision could be his last, and see how he faces the ultimate test of loyalty and forgiveness. Stay tuned to see where this emotional journey leads. Alexander's perfect world. Alexander Gray stood in his corner office, perched on the 35th floor of one of London's tallest buildings, gazing down at the city. The vast expanse of lights and buildings stretched out before him, an endless sea of possibilities. It was a rare moment of calm amidst the daily chaos of running a successful company. In the distance, he could see the first few flurries of snow falling gently, dusting the streets of Notting Hill below. But for the first time in weeks, the chill of winter didn't seem to bother him. In fact, it felt as though everything in his life had finally fallen into place. His heart raced as his hand brushed against the small velvet box in his pocket, a precious secret he had been carrying with him all day. Inside was a diamond necklace, a symbol of his love and excitement for the future. Elizabeth, his beautiful wife, had just shared the incredible news that they were expecting their first child. After 2 years of trying, countless conversations about timing and dreams of a family, this was the moment they had both been waiting for. The news was nothing short of perfect, and Alexander could hardly contain the joy that was bubbling up inside him. He could already picture their future together. Nights spent together in their cozy home in Notting Hill, weekends spent preparing the nursery, and the quiet moments of joy as they welcomed their child into the world. As his mind wandered, he imagined himself as a father, holding their baby for the first time, teaching them to walk and talk, and sharing the love that had always defined his relationship with Elizabeth. Just a few hours ago, Elizabeth had called him, her voice filled with emotion as she shared the results of her pregnancy test. The reality of it all set in, and Alexander could hardly wait to get home and celebrate with her. He checked the time. It was already 2:45 p.m. The workday would soon be over, and he would be heading home to Elizabeth. He couldn't wait to feel the warmth of their home, the familiar smell of her cooking filling the air as they celebrated their big news together. But just as Alexander was lost in thoughts of his future with Elizabeth, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with the name Charlotte, his former assistant. Alexander hesitated for a moment before declining the call. It had been 3 weeks since their last conversation, and he had made it a point to distance himself from her. Whatever Charlotte wanted could wait. Today was all about Elizabeth and the future they would create together. As Alexander straightened his tie and gathered his papers for the upcoming board meeting, he pushed any remaining thoughts of Charlotte aside. Today was about family, love, and the promises of a bright future. But little did he know, that very day would be the beginning of a life-changing revelation that would alter the course of everything he held dear. Alexander's suspicion. The board meeting dragged on, the hours slipping away as Alexander's mind wandered. He was in a room full of people, all discussing projections, investments, and quarterly reports, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Elizabeth. The nursery, the preparations for the baby, the schools they'd need to research, all of it consumed his thoughts. He couldn't help but imagine their child's first steps, the milestones of parenthood that would shape their future together. Every detail, from the paint on the nursery walls to the soft lullabies he hoped to sing, played out in his mind. Despite the urgency of the meeting, it felt as though everything around him had faded into the background. The excitement of becoming a father was overwhelming, and he found himself lost in the vision of a family, a future filled with love, laughter, and the joy of raising a child with Elizabeth. But there was something else, an unease that Alexander couldn't shake. His phone buzzed again, breaking his daydreams, and he glanced at the screen. It was Charlotte. A pang of discomfort struck him. He had been ignoring her calls for the past 3 weeks. What could she possibly want now? What was so urgent? The last time they had spoken, their professional relationship had ended on a tense note, and he had made it clear that he wanted no further contact. He quickly silenced the phone and pushed the thought of Charlotte out of his mind. It wasn't the time for distractions. Today was about Elizabeth, their future, and the excitement of becoming parents. But despite his efforts to focus, the nagging feeling in the back of his mind only grew stronger. Why was Charlotte so persistent? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that something was wrong? After the meeting ended, Alexander hurried back to his office. He tried to push away his discomfort and focus on the tasks ahead. But even as his assistant, Sarah, greeted him with the usual cheerful efficiency, Alexander couldn't shake the tension in his shoulders. He was distracted, his thoughts spinning, and he couldn't focus on the work in front of him. The unease he felt earlier now seemed to be building into something more significant. What was Charlotte trying to tell him? Why had she been calling him repeatedly? His mind raced as he tried to push these thoughts aside, but they refused to leave him. Later that afternoon, as Alexander drove back to Notting Hill, his mind was clouded with suspicion. He thought about Elizabeth, about the calls he had been avoiding, and about the life they were building together. Could there be something he didn't know? He tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept returning to Charlotte's repeated attempts to reach him. What could she possibly have to say that was so important? By the time Alexander arrived at their home, the tension in his chest was almost unbearable. His thoughts were swirling, a mixture of concern and doubt. As he entered the house, he tried to push aside the storm of emotions brewing inside him, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. And as he looked around at the life he and Elizabeth had built, he couldn't help but wonder, was everything truly as perfect as it seemed? The revelation of betrayal. The following day, Alexander woke up early, the soft light of dawn creeping through the curtains of their home in Notting Hill. The warmth of Elizabeth beside him should have been a source of peace, but the gnawing unease from the day before refused to let him rest. His mind kept replaying Charlotte's cryptic text messages and the urgency in her voice when she'd called. "We need to talk. It's about Elizabeth." The words echoed in his mind, louder than any of the noise around him. For hours, he tried to push away the suspicion that was slowly taking root. But with each passing moment, it grew harder to ignore. His mind kept returning to Charlotte, his former assistant, someone he had worked closely with for years. She had always been sharp, capable, and intelligent, but lately their professional relationship had become strained. After her departure from the company, Alexander had chosen to distance himself. And yet, her messages had continued, persistent and urgent, always focused on Elizabeth. He couldn't help but wonder, why would Charlotte be so insistent? What did she know that he didn't? Why was she contacting him repeatedly, especially when he had made it clear he no longer wanted to engage with her? Despite his discomfort, Alexander went about his day, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. He arrived at his office, greeted by his assistant Sarah, who handed him the first set of reports for his morning meetings. But as the day dragged on, it was impossible to concentrate. Every time he tried to focus on the numbers in front of him, his thoughts drifted back to Charlotte's words. His mind replayed her texts and the vague sense of dread they had caused. Something felt off, and no matter how hard he tried to shake it, the feeling only intensified. When the afternoon came, and the board meeting finally ended, Alexander couldn't take it any longer. The tension in his chest was unbearable. His phone buzzed again, and this time he answered it, his voice sharp with frustration. "What is this about, Charlotte?" he demanded. "Why have you been calling me all day?" Charlotte's voice came through the phone, low and almost a whisper. "I'm sorry to do this over the phone, Alexander, but you need to know the truth." Her tone was filled with hesitation, as if she was uncertain whether she should continue, but there was a palpable sense of urgency. "I didn't want to get involved, but you have a right to know." A cold knot formed in Alexander's stomach as the words began to sink in. He could feel his heartbeat quicken as she continued. "I've been following Elizabeth," she said. "I didn't want to believe it, but it's true." Alexander's mind went blank. What was she talking about? "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice tight with confusion and fear. Charlotte took a deep breath before answering. "She's been meeting with someone. Someone who isn't you." The world seemed to tilt beneath Alexander's feet. His grip on the phone tightened as his heart raced. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Marcus Chun," Charlotte replied. "He's a partner at Rivera and Associates, one of your company's rivals. I've seen them together. In hotels. At restaurants. Even outside your home." The world around Alexander seemed to blur as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had trusted Elizabeth. He had loved her with everything he had. They were supposed to be building a future together, raising a family, creating memories, and growing old side by side. But now, everything he thought he knew about their relationship was being called into question. "No," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking. "This can't be true." "I'm sorry, Alexander," Charlotte said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't stay silent. You deserve to know." Before Alexander could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, staring at his phone in disbelief. His mind was reeling. Elizabeth, his wife, the woman he had pledged his life to, had been seeing another man behind his back. How long had this been going on? How could she betray him like this, especially now, when they were about to become parents? His heart ached, and his hands trembled as he tried to process what he had just heard. For the rest of the day, Alexander's world seemed to spiral out of control. He cancelled all his remaining meetings, his mind consumed by the images of Elizabeth and Marcus. He couldn't focus on anything. The weight of the betrayal pressed down on him, suffocating him, making it hard to breathe. Every time he tried to push the thoughts away, they came rushing back, stronger than before. By the time evening came, Alexander's head was spinning. He pulled into the driveway of their home, the once welcoming house now feeling like a cold prison. The warmth of their home, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign. As he stepped inside, the silence was deafening. He could hear the soft sounds of Elizabeth in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner, but it didn't bring him the comfort it once had. Instead, it only made the knot in his stomach tighten further. Confrontation and the truth unfolds. As Alexander walked through the door of their home, a sense of dread weighed heavily on his chest. The warmth of their house, which had always brought him comfort, now seemed to mock him. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables, unaware of the storm that had been brewing within him all day. Her voice was cheerful, welcoming, and filled with love, just as it always had been. Yet, for Alexander, every word felt distant. The illusion of their perfect life, their perfect marriage, was cracking before his eyes. He took a deep breath, forcing a smile, though it felt unnatural. "I'm home early," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But Elizabeth, as always, saw through him. Her smile faded as she looked up from the cutting board, concern creeping into her eyes. "What's wrong, Alex?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The words that had been swirling in his mind for hours spilled out before he could stop them. "What's going on with you and Marcus Chun?" The question came out sharper than he intended, his voice breaking with a mixture of anger, confusion, and hurt. The moment the words left his mouth, Elizabeth froze. Her face drained of color, and her hands trembled slightly as she set the knife down on the counter. For a long moment, she didn't speak, the silence stretching between them like an impenetrable wall. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her, desperately searching her face for any sign of what was really going on. But all he saw was shock, disbelief, and a faint hint of fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The silence between them spoke volumes. Alexander's mind raced, images of Marcus Chun and Elizabeth meeting in secret flashing before his eyes. He had trusted her, loved her, and built a life with her. And yet, in that moment, all of it seemed like a lie. The betrayal he felt ran deep, cutting through him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The pain in his chest was sharp, raw, and all-encompassing. "Don't lie to me, Elizabeth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he fought to keep his composure. "I know about Marcus. Charlotte told me everything. I saw the pictures, the hotels, the secret meetings, everything. You've been seeing him behind my back." The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though time itself had slowed. Elizabeth still didn't say anything, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she were trying to process his words. Alexander's body shook with rage and heartbreak. The woman he loved, the woman who was carrying their child, had betrayed him. How could she? How could she do this to him? Finally, Elizabeth lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. The pain in her gaze was unmistakable, but there was something else there too, regret, fear, and perhaps even guilt. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had already been done. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know who you've been talking to, but I'm not." "Don't lie to me." Alexander cut her off, his voice rising. I know the truth. Charlotte told me everything about you and Marcus. I know about the meetings, the trips, the lies. I've been living a lie, Elizabeth. And so have you. Elizabeth stood there, motionless, as the weight of his words seemed to crush her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was speechless, and in that moment, Alexander wondered if it was because of guilt or fear. Was she afraid of losing everything? Or was it the guilt of knowing that she had destroyed the trust between them? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elizabeth found her voice. "What do you want me to say, Alexander?" Her tone was soft, almost broken. "What do you want me to say?" Alexander's anger surged, but there was a part of him that was also desperate for answers. He needed to understand why this was happening, why Elizabeth had lied to him. "I want the truth, Elizabeth. I need to know why you did this. Why did you keep it a secret? Why didn't you tell me?" For a long moment, Elizabeth didn't answer. She simply stood there, her eyes filled with tears. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "It's not what you think, Alexander." Her voice was filled with emotion, and Alexander could hear the sincerity in her words. "Yes, I've been seeing Marcus, but not in the way you're imagining. It's for the Thompson case, the biggest civil rights case of my career. Marcus and I have been working together for months. The meetings, the trips, it was all about strategy. We've been fighting for justice for families who've been wronged for years. That's all it was." Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat. His mind reeled as he tried to process her words. All the images of betrayal that had flooded his mind now seemed to shift. The anger began to fade, replaced by confusion and disbelief. Could this be true? Could Elizabeth really be telling him the truth? Was there a reasonable explanation for her secret meetings with Marcus? "Why didn't you tell me?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why keep it a secret? Why let me think the worst?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer to him. "I didn't want you to be involved in it, Alexander. I didn't want you to carry the burden of this case with me. I wanted to protect you. I thought if I kept it a secret, I could shield you from it. But I see now that in trying to protect you, I've hurt you more than I ever realized." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Alexander's heart ached, torn between the love he still had for her and the sense of betrayal that had been consuming him. He had always supported her career, always been there for her. But had she kept him out of the most important part of her life? Why hadn't she trusted him enough to let him in? A path toward healing. After a long silence filled with heavy emotion, Elizabeth looked at Alexander, her eyes filled with regret. The pain in her expression mirrored his own, but there was something else in her gaze now, a glimmer of hope, however faint. The truth had come out, and while it had hurt them both deeply, it was the first step toward healing. There were no more lies between them. What came next was uncertain, but Alexander couldn't deny that the truth had given them both something to hold on to. "I'm sorry, Alexander," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you, but in doing so, I hurt the person I love most." Alexander's heart ached as he listened to her. He wanted to hold her, to make everything okay again, but the wound of betrayal still stung too sharply. Yet, a part of him, the part that still loved her deeply, understood that Elizabeth's intentions had been born from fear, not malice. Fear of losing him. Fear of not being understood. He took a step forward, reaching for her hand. For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated, her body language still guarded. But slowly, she placed her hand in his, her grip tentative but desperate for connection. Alexander squeezed her hand gently, his heart torn between anger and the deep love that had brought them together in the first place. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Elizabeth," Alexander murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know I still love you, and I know that I want to try. If we're going to rebuild what we had, it's going to take time. We both have a lot to learn, about each other, about trust, about forgiveness." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Alexander. I want to rebuild what we've lost. I want to be with you, for our family, for our future." The room fell silent once again, but this time, the silence was different. It was filled with the possibility of healing. Though the pain of betrayal would take time to heal, there was still a chance, small but real, that they could find their way back to each other. The path would not be easy. It would require patience, understanding, and above all, trust. But for the first time in what felt like weeks, Alexander allowed himself to believe that it was possible. "I don't know what the future holds, Elizabeth," Alexander said softly, his voice filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to rebuild with you." Elizabeth's tears finally spilled over as she smiled through her pain. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving us a chance." As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of their home, Alexander realized that while they had both been through a heartbreaking betrayal, they still had one another. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But they were willing to face them together, to rebuild their trust and their love, step by step. And though they both knew the journey ahead would be long, they also knew that with time, healing, and a commitment to one another, they could find their way back to the love they had once shared. Perhaps, in the end, this would be the story of their redemption, their chance to rebuild not just their relationship, but their future as a family.